What happens when brilliance gets cut short before it reaches its full height? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the question that has haunted generations of fans, scholars, historians, and family members who watched extraordinary people build legacies that felt permanent, only to watch those same lives end before the final chapter could ever be written. This is Gone Too Soon, a carefully researched documentary countdown of 12 black celebrities who left the world before their time was up. We are not here to simply mourn. We are here to reckon with what remains: voices that reshaped music, performances that changed cinema, bodies that carried a generation's hopes, and lives that became cultural touchstones long before they were finished becoming themselves. From music icons to film legends, from athletic prodigies to voices of social change, each entry on this list represents something larger than fame. They represent brilliance interrupted, careers still rising, stories still unfolding. But here is what makes these losses cut deeper than ordinary tragedy. Many of them carried pressures the public never fully saw. Industry battles fought behind closed doors, private health crises managed in silence. The crushing weight of representing entire communities while trying to live ordinary lives beneath extraordinary expectations. Over the next 12 entries, we will count down from number 12 to number 1, the most culturally significant loss on this entire list. Each story will reveal moments you likely never knew, hidden sacrifices, forgotten achievements, real human complexity that headlines rarely captured, and the biggest revelation that comes at number 1. If you are fascinated by untold stories, triumphs, struggles, and lasting legacies of black celebrities, subscribe now. We release carefully researched documentary countdowns every week, and you will not want to miss the next story. Comment below. Which black celebrity's passing hit you hardest? Keep watching. The single most powerful story in this countdown is still ahead. Entry number 12, Lisa Left Eye Lopes. At 31 years old, Lisa Lopes was already a legend. As the creative force and unmistakable voice of TLC, one of the best-selling girl groups in history, she had helped shape an entire era of R&B and hip-hop. Songs like Waterfalls and No Scrubs did not just dominate charts, they defined the sound of the 90s and set a new standard for what female groups could achieve artistically and commercially. Born in Philadelphia in 1971 and raised in Atlanta, Lisa grew up in a strict household where musical expression became her outlet, her weapon, and ultimately her salvation. She was the songwriter, the rapper, the visionary who pushed TLC toward boundaries nobody else dared to approach. But behind the gold records and MTV dominance lay documented struggles few fully understood, a journey marked by financial exploitation, volatile relationships, and an internal battle that played out under the brightest spotlight in entertainment. On April 25, 2002, while traveling in Honduras, the vehicle Lisa was driving veered off the road to avoid collision. She was the only fatality. She was 31 years old, and according to close collaborators, she was working on solo material that would have revealed artistic dimensions TLC audiences had never heard. Her death did not just end a career, it ended a transformation still in motion. Yet what Lisa Lopes built in 3 decades continues to echo every time a female artist picks up a pen, steps to a mic, and refuses to apologize for being complicated. Number 11 on our list was building something even larger than a music career, and what they sacrificed behind closed doors would only become clear after they were gone. Entry number 11. Phyllis Hyman. There are voices that entertain, and then there are voices that reach inside you and rearrange something permanent. Phyllis Hyman had the second kind. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, possessed of a vocal range that left industry veterans speechless, and carrying a stage presence that commanded every room she ever entered, Phyllis Hyman was one of the most gifted performers jazz, soul, and R&B ever produced. Songs like Somewhere in My Lifetime and You Know How to Love Me were not simply beautiful recordings. They were emotional confessions wrapped in orchestration so precise it felt architectural. Born in Philadelphia in 1949, Phyllis grew up navigating a difficult home environment before relocating to New York City, where the music scene recognized what she was almost immediately. By the late 1970s, she was performing at Carnegie Hall, recording for Buddha Records, and earning comparisons to Lena Horne and Billie Holiday. Comparisons she welcomed, but also quietly resisted, because Phyllis Hyman was building something entirely. What the public rarely saw was the depth of her documented struggle with bipolar disorder, a condition she spoke about openly in interviews, but that the music industry consistently failed to support or accommodate. Despite critical acclaim throughout her career, mainstream commercial success remained frustratingly out of reach, a gap between her artistic stature and her commercial recognition that she addressed directly and painfully in documented interviews. On June 30, 1995, the same night she was scheduled to perform at the Apollo Theater, Phyllis Hyman was found in her apartment. She had taken her own life. She left behind a note. She was 45 years old. What she also left behind was a catalog that has only grown in critical stature since her passing, in a story that forces an honest question about how the music industry treats artists whose brilliance does not arrive in commercially convenient packaging. Number 10 on this countdown stepped into one of the most hostile environments in professional sports and responded by becoming one of the most dominant athletes of his generation. But the story behind his rise contains a chapter that most sports documentaries have never fully examined. Entry number 10. Len Bias. There is a version of American sports history where Len Bias plays 12 seasons in Boston alongside Larry Bird, helps the Celtics build another dynasty, becomes one of the defining players of his NBA generation, and retires as a first-ballot Hall of Famer. That version never happened. What happened instead became one of the most devastating sports stories in American history, and one whose consequences reached far beyond basketball into national policy, community devastation, and 2 decades of legislation that would alter millions of lives. Leonard Kevin Bias was born in Landover, Maryland in 1963. He grew up in a devout, disciplined household shaped by his father James and mother Lanice, 2 parents whose influence on his character is documented clearly by teammates, coaches, and friends who knew him throughout his life. From his earliest years, basketball was not simply something Len was good at, it was something he approached with a seriousness that separated him from every other player his age. At the University of Maryland, Bias developed into the most electrifying college basketball player in the country. His combination of length, athleticism, footwork, and competitive intensity drew comparisons to a young Michael Jordan, comparisons that Jordan himself later acknowledged were not exaggerated. 2-time ACC Player of the Year. A player whose college highlights still circulate today because they remain genuinely difficult to believe. On June 17, 1986, the Boston Celtics selected Len Bias with the 2nd overall pick in the NBA draft. He flew home to Maryland, he celebrated with friends, and in the early hours of June 19th, at age 22, Len Bias suffered a cocaine-induced cardiac arrest and died before reaching a hospital. The shock was immediate and national, but what followed his death extended further than grief. The political response to Bias's death helped accelerate the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, legislation that introduced mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines, widely documented as having a disproportionate and devastating impact on Black communities across America for decades. A young man's death became a political instrument, his family's grief became a legislative moment, and the communities that loved athletes like Len Bias bore consequences they never consented to carry. What Len Bias represented on a basketball court was once in a generation. What his death set in motion is a chapter of American history that scholars, activists, and legal reformers are still actively addressing today. Number 9 on this countdown built a legacy so large that it reshaped an entire cultural industry, and yet the personal story running beneath all of that public success has rarely been examined with the depth and honesty it deserves. What their closest circle has since confirmed changes everything about how we understand who they actually were. There are comedians who make you laugh, and then there are comedians who make you feel genuinely seen, who take the most painful corners of real life, hold them up under a spotlight, and somehow transform them into something that heals. Bernie Mac was the second kind. Born Bernard Jeffrey McCullough on October 5, 1957, on the south side of Chicago, Bernie grew up in a world that did not offer much softness. Poverty was constant. Loss arrived early. His mother died of cancer when he was 16 years old, a wound that shaped his comedy, his worldview, and the unmistakable emotional undercurrent that ran beneath every performance he ever gave. He did not start performing to get rich or famous. He started performing because it was the one thing that made sense in a life that frequently did not. For years, Bernie Mac worked the Chicago comedy circuit without a safety net, no industry connections, no famous mentors, no shortcuts. What he had was material drawn directly from lived experience and a stage presence so commanding that audiences had no choice but to pay attention. By the time he joined Cedric the Entertainer, Steve Harvey, D.L. Hewley, and the original Kings of Comedy tour in 2000, he was already a seasoned veteran, but the Kings of Comedy concert film introduced him to a national audience on a scale that changed everything almost overnight. His stand-up set from that film remains one of the most studied and referenced performances in American comedy history, not simply because it was funny, but because it was structurally brilliant, emotionally layered, and completely, unapologetically authentic in a way that reflected a specific Black American experience with precision and love. The Bernie Mac Show, which ran from 2001 to 2006, earned him a Peabody Award and a Golden Globe nomination, recognition that confirmed what Chicago audiences had known for years. Bernie Mac was not just a comedian, he was a storyteller operating at the highest level of his craft. What most audiences did not know during those years of peak visibility was that Bernie had been living with sarcoidosis, a chronic inflammatory disease affecting his lungs, since the 1980s. He managed the condition largely in private, performing through flare-ups and hospitalizations that his public persona never betrayed. On August 9, 2008, Bernie Mac died from complications related to pneumonia, which had accelerated his underlying condition. He was 50 years old. Isaac Hayes died the same weekend. The loss landed like a physical blow on an entertainment community that had no warning it was coming. What Bernie left behind was more than a legacy of laughter. He left a documented model of artistic discipline, personal endurance, and the particular genius of finding universal humanity inside deeply specific experience. If this documentary has been keeping you engaged, now is the perfect time to subscribe. Every week we release carefully researched documentaries that go beyond the surface of Black celebrity stories and uncover the complete picture. Hit subscribe, drop a comment below telling us which celebrity on this countdown has meant the most to you, and let us know who you think is coming up next, because the most powerful entries, the ones with the biggest revelations, are still ahead. Number 8 on this countdown achieved a level of cultural visibility that almost no one in their field had reached before. But what their closest collaborators have since revealed about the private reality running beneath all of that public success is a chapter that reframes everything we thought we understood about who they actually were. Entry number 8, Michael Clarke Duncan. Not every story on this countdown belongs to someone who was famous for decades. Some belong to people who arrived later than most, worked harder than most, and in a short window of time left a mark on their industry that younger artists are still measuring themselves against today. Michael Clarke Duncan arrived in Hollywood in his 30s. He left it as one of the most beloved performers of his generation. Born on December 10, 1957, in Chicago, the same city that produced Bernie Mac, Michael grew up in a neighborhood where survival required toughness, and where dreams were treated as luxuries that most people could not afford to carry for long. He worked as a ditch digger. He worked as a bodyguard, protecting some of Hollywood's biggest names before Hollywood ever knew his own. What kept him going through years of near invisibility was a documented, unshakable belief that his moment was coming, a belief his mother, Jean Duncan, had planted in him early and that he returned to in multiple interviews throughout his career. His moment arrived in 1999 when director Frank Darabont cast him as John Coffey in The Green Mile, an adaptation of Stephen King's novel that required Duncan to carry the emotional weight of an entire film on a frame that Hollywood had never quite known how to place in a leading dramatic role. The performance he delivered was not simply good, it was genuinely overwhelming. A 6'5", 300-pound man conveying tenderness, spiritual depth, and heartbreak with such precision that the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nominated him for Best Supporting Actor, only the second black man nominated in that category in the previous decade. He did not win, but the nomination permanently altered what casting directors believed was possible, and it opened doors in Hollywood for physically imposing black actors that had been largely closed before his performance forced them open. What most people never fully registered was that Michael Clarke Duncan achieved all of this after an industry had spent years looking past him, and that he did so without bitterness, without public grievance, and with a warmth that everyone who worked alongside him has consistently documented as entirely genuine rather than performed. On September 3, 2012, Michael Clarke Duncan died from complications following a heart attack he had suffered 2 months earlier. He was 54 years old. His partner at the time, Omarosa Manigault, had performed CPR at the scene and credited that intervention with extending his life by the weeks that followed. His mother, the woman who had told him his moment was coming, outlived him, a grief documented by those close to the family as among the most painful dimensions of a loss that hit the entertainment community without warning. What Michael Clarke Duncan proved in a career shorter than most is that arrival time does not determine impact. What you do once you get there does. We are now entering the top 7, and the entries ahead carry a different kind of weight entirely. Number 7 on this countdown was so far ahead of their time that the industry they worked in spent years trying to contain what they were building. What they sacrificed to keep creating is one of the most overlooked stories in this entire documentary. Entry number 7, Eazy-E. There are figures in music history who are remembered for what they created. And then there are figures who are remembered for what they started, whose fingerprints are on an entire genre, an entire industry, and an entire generation of artists who built careers on the foundation that one person laid before most of the world understood what was being constructed. Eric Lynn Wright, known everywhere as Eazy-E, was that kind of figure. Born on September 7, 1964, in Compton, California, Eric grew up in a city that the mainstream entertainment industry had largely ignored, in a community whose daily realities were considered too raw, too specific, and too uncomfortable for commercial consumption. What he understood, before record labels, before critics, before cultural gatekeepers of any kind, was that those realities were not liabilities, they were the story, and the story deserved to be told exactly as it was, without softening, without translation, and without apology. In 1986, using money that federal prosecutors would later scrutinize, Eazy-E founded Ruthless Records, an independent label at a time when black-owned independent labels operating outside the established industry infrastructure were treated as novelties rather than legitimate competitors. What Ruthless Records became was neither a novelty nor a footnote. It became the home of N.W., a group whose debut album Straight Outta Compton, released in 1988, arrived without mainstream radio support, without significant label backing, and without a traditional promotional infrastructure, and still sold over 2 million copies on the strength of word of mouth alone. The FBI sent a letter to their distributor expressing concern about the content. The letter only amplified the attention. By the early 1990s, N.W. had effectively created the commercial architecture for West Coast gangster rap, a genre that would go on to generate billions of dollars in revenue for an industry that had initially refused to take it seriously. What history sometimes compresses into a simple narrative of street credibility and controversy is actually a more complex story about black entrepreneurial vision operating in hostile commercial territory. Eazy-E was not simply a provocateur. He was a businessman who identified an underserved audience, built an independent infrastructure to reach them, and created a platform that launched the careers of Dr. Dre, Ice Cube, and MC Ren, artists whose individual legacies now span decades. The internal collapse of N.W. Driven by documented financial disputes, management conflicts involving Jerry Heller, and creative tensions that eventually pulled Ice Cube and then Dr. Dre away from Ruthless, has been examined from multiple perspectives over the years. What those accounts consistently confirm is that Eazy-E navigated those conflicts as both a participant and a victim of an industry where black artists rarely held the contractual leverage their commercial value should have guaranteed them. By 1995, Eazy-E had begun publicly reconciling with former collaborators and was working on material that suggested artistic evolution beyond the persona that had made him famous. In February of that year, he checked into Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, believing he had asthma. The diagnosis was AIDS. He had been infected with HIV, though the precise circumstances were never publicly established. On March 26, 1995, less than 2 months after his diagnosis, Eazy-E died. He was 30 years old. He left behind a public statement, released from his hospital bed, that was dignified, direct, and entirely consistent with how people who knew him described his character when the performance of toughness was no longer required. He asked that his death serve as a warning. He expressed love for his family and his fans, and he signed off the way he had always operated, on his own terms. What Eazy-E built in 3 decades still generates revenue, still influences artists, and still defines the sound of a city and an era. The industry that once dismissed what he was doing now teaches it in music business programs at universities across the country. Number 6 on this countdown achieved something that almost no one in their industry had achieved before them, and they did it while carrying a private weight that their closest collaborators only fully understood after they were gone. What has since emerged about their final years reframes the entire arc of a career that was already historic. Entry number 6. Whitney Houston. Some voices arrive in the world already complete, already operating at a level that seems less like selling physical singles ever released. The film itself was a deliberate act of representation, a major Hollywood production centered on a black woman in a romantic lead, at a time when the industry routinely treated that concept as a commercial risk rather than a cultural opportunity. What the award shows, the record sales, and the magazine covers did not capture was the complexity of what Whitney Houston was navigating beneath the surface of all that achievement. Her marriage to Bobby Brown, which began in 1992, was documented as turbulent through court records, public incidents, and Whitney's own candid admissions in interviews that she gave years later. Her documented struggle with substance abuse, which she addressed directly and without evasion in a 2002 interview with Diane Sawyer that remains one of the most watched celebrity interviews ever recorded, was real, ongoing, and costly in ways that extended beyond her career into her health and her relationships. What that Diane Sawyer interview also revealed, to audiences willing to listen carefully, was that Whitney Houston was a woman of genuine intelligence, self-awareness, and humor, someone who understood her own story with more clarity than most of the people writing about her ever managed to achieve. The industry's response to her struggles reflected a pattern documented across this entire countdown: public figures whose private pain became entertainment, whose vulnerability was monetized, and whose complexity was flattened into a cautionary narrative that made for easier consumption than the actual human truth. By 2009, Whitney had staged a documented professional return, a world tour, a new album that demonstrated her voice, though changed by years of documented strain, retained power, and emotional authority that newer artists openly acknowledged they could not replicate. The return was imperfect by the standards of her peak years. It was also extraordinary by the standards of anyone who understood what she had been through. On February 11, 2012, Whitney Houston was found unresponsive in her hotel room at the Beverly Hilton in Beverly Hills. She was 48 years old. The cause of death was accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors by the Los Angeles County coroner. She died the night before the Grammy Awards, an event she had attended and dominated throughout the greatest years of her career. The timing felt less like coincidence and more like a final, painful statement about the distance between the world that celebrated her and the one she was actually living in. What Whitney Houston left behind is measurable and immeasurable in equal parts. The measurable part is documented in sales figures, records, and awards that still stand. The immeasurable part lives in every artist who has ever stood in front of a microphone and understood, in that moment, exactly what they were measuring themselves against. We are now inside the top 5, and from this point forward, every entry carries the kind of cultural weight that does not simply belong to entertainment history, it belongs to history itself. Number 5 built something so significant that it changed what an entire generation believed was possible, and the story behind that achievement has a chapter that has never been told this completely. Entry number 5, Nipsey Hussle. There is a particular kind of leader who does not wait for permission, who looks at a broken system, decides not to petition it for change, and instead builds something entirely new right beside it, something so solid, so community-rooted, and so practically useful that the broken system eventually has to acknowledge what got built without its blessing. Ermias Joseph Azkadam, known to the world as Nipsey Hussle, was that kind of leader. Born on August 15, 1985, in Los Angeles, California, Nipsey grew up in the Crenshaw district, a neighborhood whose challenges were real and extensively documented, but whose community identity, cultural richness, and collective pride were consistently underrepresented in the mainstream narratives that reduced it to a zip code associated with danger. From his earliest years, Nipsey moved through that neighborhood with a quality that people who knew him have consistently described in interviews as unusual, a combination of street credibility and genuine intellectual curiosity that most environments would have forced him to choose between. He chose neither. He carried both. His entry into rap came through years of grinding mixtape releases that built a fiercely loyal following in Los Angeles before the broader industry took notice. What separated Nipsey from the beginning was not just the quality of his lyricism, though that quality was documented and praised by artists whose own credentials were beyond dispute, but his understanding of the business architecture surrounding music. He studied ownership. He studied distribution. He studied the specific mechanisms by which Black artists historically generated enormous value for industries that returned very little of that value to the artists themselves or their communities. In 2013, he sold 1,000 copies of his Proud to Pay mixtape at $100 each, a deliberate conceptual statement about value, ownership, and the relationship between artists and their audiences that marketing professors at business schools have since cited as genuinely innovative. The strategy attracted the attention of both fans and industry executives, not because it maximized short-term revenue, but because it demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that the music business rarely encountered from artists at his career stage. His 2018 debut studio album, Victory Lap, was nominated for the Grammy Award for Best Rap Album, a recognition that arrived after years of independent grinding that had already made him a multi-million-dollar independent operator before a major label ever entered the conversation. But the work Nipsey Hussle considered most significant was not the music, it was the infrastructure. The Marathon clothing store he opened in the Crenshaw district was not simply a retail location. It was a documented community anchor, a space that housed a co-working facility, supported local entrepreneurs, and represented a physical, permanent investment in a neighborhood that corporate America had spent decades disinvesting from. He partnered with local leaders on economic development initiatives. He worked with tech entrepreneurs on STEM education programs for young people in South Los Angeles. He had an active meeting scheduled with Los Angeles Police Department officials to discuss gang intervention strategies on the day he was killed. On March 31, 2019, Nipsey Hussle was shot and killed outside his own store in the Crenshaw district. He was 33 years old. The man convicted of his murder was someone from his own community, a detail that made the grief more complicated and the loss more painful for the people who had believed most deeply in what he was building. The Los Angeles City Council renamed the intersection outside his store Nipsey Hussle Square. His memorial service drew thousands of mourners and was broadcast live, President Barack Obama released a personal written statement. The Recording Academy awarded him 2 posthumous Grammys in 2020. What Nipsey Hussle left behind exists in 2 distinct registers. The first is emotional, the grief of a community that lost someone who was genuinely invested in its survival and growth. The second is structural, the businesses, the initiatives, the documented partnerships, and the model of community ownership that his team has continued building in his name. The marathon, as he always said, continues. 4 entries remain. And number 4 on this countdown achieved something so globally significant that it permanently expanded what the world believed Black excellence could look like at the highest levels of their field. But the story behind that achievement, the sacrifices made, the battles fought, and what it ultimately cost, is far more layered than most people have ever been allowed to see. Entry number 4, Jackie Wilson. Before James Brown claimed the title, before Michael Jackson redefined what a performer could physically do on a stage, before the entire vocabulary of modern Black performance, as the world now understands it existed in its current form, there was Jackie Wilson. And without Jackie Wilson, the line between what came before and what came after is impossible to draw cleanly. Jack Leroy Wilson, Jr. was born on June 9, 1934, in Detroit, Michigan, a city that would go on to produce some of the most significant figures in American musical history, but that had never quite produced anyone like Jackie Wilson before him, and has not produced anyone quite like him since. He grew up in a neighborhood where toughness was not optional, where the church provided both spiritual grounding and musical foundation, and where his voice, a tenor of extraordinary range and emotional flexibility, was recognized as exceptional before he fully understood what exceptional meant in practical terms. As a teenager, he trained as a boxer, a discipline that would later inform the physical precision and athletic command he brought to a stage. He won the Golden Gloves welterweight title in Detroit at 16. But music pulled harder than sport, and by his late teens he had joined Billy Ward and his Dominoes, a group whose vocal arrangements gave Wilson the technical framework his natural gift needed before it was ready to operate independently. His solo career launched in 1957 with Reet Petite, a record co-written by a young Berry Gordy, who would go on to found Motown Records and build the most successful Black-owned music enterprise in American history. The professional relationship between Wilson and Gordy in those early years is a documented chapter in the larger story of how Black musical talent and Black entrepreneurial vision intersected in Detroit during the late 1950s in ways that permanently altered American popular music. What followed that debut was a run of recordings and live performances that journalists, musicians, and cultural historians have described using language typically reserved for once-in-a-century talents. To Be Loved, Lonely Teardrops, Higher and Higher, That's Why. Each record demonstrated a vocal instrument capable of moving between gospel urgency, pop accessibility, and R&B depth within a single song, sometimes within a single phrase. But it was the live performance where Jackie Wilson fully separated himself from every other entertainer of his era. He did not simply perform songs, he inhabited them physically, moving across stages with a combination of choreographic precision and spontaneous energy that audiences found genuinely difficult to process in real time because nothing quite like it had existed before. James Brown, in documented interviews, credited Wilson directly as a primary influence on his own performance style. Michael Jackson's debt to Wilson is visible in footage comparisons that fans and historians have made for decades: the footwork, the spins, the physical commitment to every musical moment. Elvis Presley acknowledged the influence. That acknowledgement matters historically not simply as a biographical footnote, but as a documented record of how Black performance genius moved through American popular culture, absorbed, translated, commercially amplified, and far too rarely credited with the directness the original source deserved. What Jackie Wilson did not receive during his lifetime was the financial security that his commercial impact should have generated. His contractual arrangements in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the period of his greatest chart success, were structured in ways that returned a fraction of the revenue his recordings produced to the man actually producing them. This was not an accident of an unsophisticated artist who failed to protect himself. It was a systemic feature of an industry that routinely extracted maximum value from black artists while returning minimum compensation, a pattern documented across the careers of dozens of the most commercially successful black performers of that era. By the 1970s, his commercial visibility had declined, a trajectory common among artists of his generation as popular tastes shifted and the industry moved on to the next wave of talent without pausing to adequately compensate or celebrate what the previous generation had built. He was performing in smaller venues, recording less frequently, and navigating the particular kind of financial precarity that decades of industry exploitation had made almost structurally inevitable. On September 29, 1975, Jackie Wilson suffered a massive heart attack while performing on stage at the Latin Casino in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. He collapsed mid-performance during Lonely Teardrops, the same song he had recorded nearly 2 decades earlier when his career was just beginning. He struck his head on the stage as he fell. The resulting brain damage left him in a coma from which he never fully recovered. He lived for 8 more years in a care facility, largely unable to communicate, dependent on institutional support, and visited by family members who watched one of the most extraordinary performers in American history exist in conditions that bore no relationship to the magnitude of what he had contributed. He died on January 24, 1984. He was 49 years old. Jackie Wilson was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987, 3 years after his death. The recognition was deserved. The timing, arriving decades after his peak contributions and years after his death, reflected a pattern of delayed institutional acknowledgement that this countdown has documented across multiple entries. What Jackie Wilson left behind is not simply a catalog of recordings, though that catalog is extraordinary and has influenced more artists than can be accurately counted. What he left behind is the physical language of modern black performance itself. Every spin, every controlled fall, every moment of athletic grace combined with emotional authenticity that audiences have watched on stages and screens for the past 60 years carries Jackie Wilson's fingerprints, whether the performer delivering it knows his name or not. This documentary has already uncovered stories that go far deeper than most people ever knew, and the 3 entries still ahead are the most powerful chapters in this entire countdown. The revelations, the sacrifices, the hidden truths, and the legacies that changed history are all still coming. Subscribe right now so you never miss a documentary like this one. Drop a comment below and tell us, did Jackie Wilson's story surprise you? And who do you think is coming in at number 3? Keep watching. The biggest stories in this countdown are still ahead.
3 entries remain.
And the person at number 3 on this countdown was building something so culturally significant, expanding so rapidly across music, film, and global influence that the industry itself had not yet caught up to where she was going. What makes her story one of the most important in this entire documentary is not simply how it ended, it is everything she was still in the middle of becoming. Entry number 3, Aaliyah. There are artists who define a moment, and then there are artists who define a movement, whose influence does not peak and recede, but instead spreads quietly and permanently into the creative DNA of everyone who comes after them. Aaliyah Dana Houghton was 22 years old when she died. She had already done both, born on January 16, 1979 in Brooklyn, New York, and raised in Detroit, Michigan. Aaliyah grew up in a household where ambition was treated as a reasonable expectation rather than an unlikely dream. Her uncle Barry Hankerson was an entertainment manager whose industry connections gave her early access to professional environments most young artists spend years trying to reach. By the time she was 10 years old, she had performed on Star Search. By 12, she was performing alongside Gladys Knight in Las Vegas. By 15, she had signed her first record deal. What happened next is one of the most important and most painful chapters in her story, and it cannot be told honestly without full acknowledgement of what the documented record shows. Her debut album, Age Ain't Nothing But a Number, was released in 1994 when Aaliyah was 15. It was written and produced by R. Kelly, who was 27 at the time. Court documents obtained by investigative journalists confirmed that Kelly and Aaliyah had been illegally married in August 1994, with a falsified marriage certificate listing her age as 18. The marriage was annulled by her parents shortly after it became known. Aaliyah never spoke publicly about the relationship in specific terms. Her family moved quickly and deliberately to separate her professionally and personally from Kelly, and the decision to rebuild her career on entirely new creative foundations was made with urgency and clarity. That rebuilding is where the second chapter of Aaliyah's story, the one that defines her enduring legacy, truly begins. In 1996, she released One in a Million, produced almost entirely by Timbaland and Missy Elliott. The album was not simply a commercial follow-up. It was a creative declaration. The production was unlike anything else in R&B at the time, spare, rhythmically complex, built on unconventional percussion patterns and space that most producers of that era would never have left unfilled. Aaliyah moved through those sonic landscapes with a coolness and precision that felt effortless precisely because it was so completely controlled. The album sold over 3 million copies. More significantly, it established an aesthetic template, the quiet storm of her vocal delivery, the androgynous edge of her visual style, the deliberate balance between accessibility and avant-garde experimentation that artists from Beyoncé to Rihanna to Drake have cited as directly foundational to their own creative approaches. Her 2001 self-titled album pushed further. We Need a Resolution, More Than a Woman, Rock the Boat. Each track demonstrated an artist expanding her range with genuine intention, moving toward sounds that the mainstream had not yet caught up with. Simultaneously, she was building a film career with the same deliberateness she had applied to her musical reinvention. Her role in Romeo Must Die in 2000 showed audiences a screen presence that translated her musical charisma into a different medium without losing any of its distinctive quality. Queen of the Damned, released posthumously in 2002, confirmed that the transition was not accidental. She had been offered additional major film roles. She had specific projects in active development. The trajectory was clear, and the people around her have said consistently in documented interviews that she was more excited about where her career was going than at any previous point. In August 2001, Aaliyah traveled to the Bahamas to film the music video for Rock the Boat. The shoot completed, she and her team boarded a small Cessna 402 aircraft for the return flight to the United States on August 25th. The plane was documented as carrying more weight than its certified capacity. The pilot, who toxicology reports later confirmed had cocaine and alcohol in his system at the time of the flight, lost control shortly after takeoff. The aircraft crashed. 8 of the 9 people on board died at the scene. Aaliyah was among them. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation confirmed the aircraft was overloaded by approximately 700 pounds. Questions about how the flight was organized, who approved the boarding, and why a plane was allowed to depart under those conditions have never been fully resolved to the satisfaction of her family or the public. The grief was immediate and global. Radio stations held continuous tribute broadcasts. Fellow artists released statements that read less like professional courtesies and more like personal losses, because for many of them, that is exactly what it was. The BET Awards dedicated an extended memorial tribute. MTV aired a documentary within weeks of her death. What the grief also revealed was how deeply Aaliyah's image, her sound, and her specific quality of cool elegance had embedded themselves into the emotional lives of audiences who had watched her grow up in public. She was not mourned as a celebrity. She was mourned as someone who felt personal, whose music had soundtracked specific moments, specific feelings, specific years in the lives of people who had never met her. More than 2 decades later, that relationship between Aaliyah and her audience has not diminished. It has deepened. Her catalog, which remained largely unavailable on streaming platforms for years due to ongoing legal and estate disputes, finally became accessible in 2021, and the response confirmed what her fans had always known. The music had not aged. If anything, it had clarified, revealing layers of production sophistication and vocal nuance that contemporary listeners, equipped with better audio technology and broader musical reference points, could appreciate in ways that even her original audience could not fully access. Aaliyah at number 3 on this countdown represents something specific and irreplaceable, the particular tragedy of an artist who had already survived exploitation, rebuilt her identity, and was actively becoming something even larger than what she had already been, cut short at the precise moment when the full scope of what she was building was finally coming into view. 2 entries remain. And the person at number 2 is someone whose genius operated on a scale so large, whose contradictions ran so deep, and whose unresolved story has generated so much ongoing conversation that nearly 30 years after his death, the world is still not finished processing what he left behind. His story begins in a place most people would never connect to one of the most influential artists in American music history. Entry number 2, Tupac Shakur. There are artists whose work reflects their era, and then there are artists whose work defines it, whose voice becomes so completely identified with a specific period in cultural history that separating the music from the moment feels less like an analytical exercise and more like an act of deliberate removal. Tupac Amaru Shakur was that kind of artist. Except his voice did not simply define the 1990s. It has continued defining every decade that followed in ways that nobody fully anticipated and that the culture is still actively working to understand. He was born on June 16, 1971, in East Harlem, New York City, born to Afeni Shakur, a Black Panther Party activist who was facing serious federal charges at the time of his birth and who raised him inside a framework of political consciousness, Black history, and radical thinking that most American children never encounter, and that Tupac was absorbing before he was old enough to fully articulate what it meant. At 13, he enrolled in the Baltimore School for the Arts, a moment that represents one of the most important and least discussed chapters of his entire biography. In Baltimore, Tupac studied acting, poetry, jazz, and ballet. He performed in Shakespeare productions. He formed a close documented friendship with Jada Pinkett, a friendship she has discussed in multiple interviews throughout her public life as one of the most genuine and intellectually stimulating relationships of her formative years. The Baltimore period gave Tupac a formal creative vocabulary that his raw talent needed, and it is visible, for anyone paying attention, in the structural sophistication of his best lyrics, which operate simultaneously as confessional poetry, social criticism, dramatic monologue, and musical composition. His artistic evolution accelerated rapidly. Strictly for My Niggaz in 1993 demonstrated expanding commercial range. His acting career developed alongside his music. Juice in 1992 and Poetic Justice in 1993 showed a dramatic talent that critics and audiences acknowledged as genuine rather than celebrity adjacent. He was building 2 distinct careers simultaneously, with documented seriousness in both directions, at an age when most artists are still trying to establish one. All Eyes on Me, released in February 1996, became one of the best-selling rap albums in history. It contained multitudes, celebration, paranoia, tenderness, defiance, vulnerability, and fury, existing simultaneously in a way that reflected exactly where Tupac himself was during that period. By mid-1996, he had begun speaking in interviews about wanting to leave death row, start his own label, and move toward music that reflected the artistic evolution he felt his work was ready for. Those plans were never realized, bombing Nem Nono Uwang in the Harding in the nearly 3 decades since his death. The volume of credible investigative journalism, documentary filmmaking, law enforcement testimony, and documented witness accounts attempting to establish what happened that night has been extraordinary, and what that volume reveals, more than any single theory, is that the institutional failure to deliver justice for one of the most famous murder victims in American history is itself a fact that carries moral and historical weight. Tupac's posthumous catalog, assembled from the extraordinary volume of unreleased material he had recorded, has generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. His image remains one of the most commercially reproduced in entertainment history. Academic courses examining his work have been offered at universities including Harvard, the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Washington. His lyrics have been cited in legal briefs, political speeches, and philosophical papers examining the relationship between art and social reality. One entry remains at the top of this countdown, and the person at number 1 is someone whose story carries every element this documentary has been building toward: private endurance, public excellence, historic achievement, and a revelation that, when it finally reached the world, did not diminish what he had accomplished. It made everything he had done feel almost impossible to fully comprehend. The number 1 entry is next. Entry number 1, Chadwick Boseman. On the night of August 28, 2020, a single social media post stopped the internet. It came from Chadwick Boseman's verified accounts simultaneously. It contained a photograph, a brief statement, and a fact that the world had no preparation for whatsoever: that the man who had spent the previous 4 years portraying kings, legends, and icons on the largest screens in the world had been privately fighting stage 3 colon cancer since 2016. He was 43 years old. He was gone. The response was not simply grief. It was disbelief layered over grief, the particular kind of shock that arrives when you realize that something enormous was happening in plain sight and nobody saw it, because the person at the center of it had decided with complete deliberateness that the world did not need to know. To understand why Chadwick Boseman is number 1 on this countdown, you have to begin not in Hollywood, but in Anderson, South Carolina, a small city in the western part of the state where he was born on November 29, 1976, the third son of Leroy and Carolyn Boseman. His father ran an upholstery business. His mother was a nurse. The household was grounded in faith, in discipline, and in the particular kind of practical dignity that Black families in the American South have cultivated across generations as both a survival strategy and a statement of identity. From his earliest years, Boseman was drawn to storytelling, not simply as entertainment, but as a tool for examining truth. He studied directing at Howard University, an HBCU in Washington, D.C., whose history, intellectual tradition, and community of Black excellence shaped his understanding of what storytelling was actually for. Howard did not simply teach him craft. It gave him context, a deep, historically grounded framework for understanding why Black stories mattered, what had been done to suppress them, and what was still possible if someone was willing to do the work required to tell them at the highest level. After Howard, he pursued graduate training in acting at the British American Drama Academy at Oxford, a decision that reflects the seriousness with which he approached his craft long before the industry had given him any significant reason to believe that seriousness would be rewarded. The early years of his professional career were quiet by Hollywood standards: television appearances, stage work, the patient accumulation of craft and experience that most audiences never see and that most entertainment coverage never bothers to document. What those years produced was an actor whose technical foundation was genuinely exceptional, someone capable of inhabiting historical figures with specificity and depth, rather than simply performing their most famous moments. His breakthrough came in 2013 with 42, the biographical film in which he portrayed Jackie Robinson, the first Black player in Major League Baseball's modern era. The performance demanded physical transformation, historical precision, and the emotional capacity to convey the specific experience of a man required to absorb public hatred with disciplined restraint while competing at the highest level of his sport. Boseman delivered all of it, and the critical and audience response confirmed that something unusual had arrived in Hollywood. What followed was a sequence of historical portraits that has no real parallel in contemporary American cinema. In 2014, he portrayed James Brown in Get On Up, a performance that required him to physically embody one of the most kinetically extraordinary performers in music history, which he accomplished through months of documented preparation that included direct work with Brown's former collaborators and an immersion in archival footage that went far beyond what most biographical performances demand. In 2017, he portrayed Thurgood Marshall in Marshall, the first African-American justice of the United States Supreme Court, shown here as a young NAACP lawyer navigating a racially charged criminal case in Connecticut. The film demonstrated Boseman's ability to carry a legal drama on intelligence and charisma alone, without the physical spectacle that his Brown performance had required. 3 biographical films, 3 completely different disciplines: baseball, performance, law. 3 completely different physical and emotional registers, 3 performances that would each have represented a career achievement for most working actors. And then came T'Challa, Black Panther, released in February 2018 and directed by Ryan Coogler, was not simply a superhero film. It was a cultural event whose significance extended far beyond the Marvel Cinematic Universe into conversations about representation, imagination, African identity, and what it means for Black children to see themselves centered, not as supporting characters, not as comic relief, not as tragic figures, but as royalty, as scientists, as warriors, as the most technologically advanced civilization on Earth. He underwent surgery. He underwent chemotherapy. He continued working. He filmed Black Panther during cancer treatment. He filmed Avengers: Infinity War and Avengers: Endgame during cancer treatment. He filmed Da 5 Bloods for Spike Lee during cancer treatment. He filmed Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, the performance that would earn him a posthumous Academy Award nomination, during cancer treatment, by which point his illness had progressed to stage 4. The public appearances during this period, the award shows, the press tours, the fan interactions, were later examined by people who had been present and who, with the knowledge of what he was carrying, could identify moments of visible physical strain that had been attributed to other causes at the time. His weight fluctuated noticeably in public photographs across the period. Fans had noticed, questions had circulated, his team consistently protected his privacy, and Boseman himself never confirmed or addressed the speculation publicly. There is documented evidence of what he was doing with some of the time he was not spending on set. He visited St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, and other medical facilities where young patients, children who loved Black Panther, children fighting their own cancers, received visits from the man who played their king. He did this while he himself was in treatment. The documented accounts of those visits, shared by hospital staff and family members of the children involved, represent something that sits outside the ordinary vocabulary of celebrity philanthropy. They represent a man who understood from the inside what those children were facing, and who chose, repeatedly, to show up for them anyway. His close collaborators, directors, co-stars, crew members, have given interviews since his death, describing a professional environment in which his commitment, his preparation, and his presence never wavered in ways they could detect. Ryan Coogler, in his public statement following Boseman's death, described learning about the illness only after the announcement and recounting memories of their work together that took on completely different meaning with that knowledge now present. The final chapter of his public creative life was Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, the filmed adaptation of August Wilson's landmark play, in which Boseman portrayed Leve, a young, ambitious, volatile trumpet player whose hunger and talent collide with the specific racial and commercial realities of 1920s Chicago in ways that Wilson understood as a microcosm of the larger Black American experience. The performance is raw, physical, and emotionally exposed in ways that feel different now than they would have felt if his illness had been public knowledge during filming. Whether that difference represents something Boseman consciously channeled or something the audience projects retrospectively is a question that film scholars and critics have debated with genuine seriousness since the film's release. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nominated him posthumously for Best Actor. He did not win, a decision that generated significant public debate and that the Academy's voting membership has never publicly explained. What the nomination confirmed, regardless of the outcome, was that the industry recognized his final performance as operating at the absolute summit of American screen acting. Chadwick Boseman is number 1 on this countdown, for reasons that this chapter has attempted to document with the completeness they deserve. The scale of his cultural impact, particularly through Black Panther, is measurable and historically significant. The range of his biographical work across 4 years represents an achievement with no contemporary parallel. The discipline and dignity with which he managed a terminal illness while continuing to create at the highest level of his craft is documented and verified and remains genuinely difficult to fully absorb. But the reason he sits at number 1 above every other entry on this list is something slightly different, and it is the reason his story continues to generate emotional responses from people who encounter it for the first time years after his death. Chadwick Boseman did not simply work through illness. He chose, deliberately and consistently, to spend his remaining time and energy creating things that would matter to other people. He played heroes for children who needed them. He visited sick kids while he was sick himself. He protected his privacy not out of vanity, but out of a documented desire to keep the focus on the work rather than on his condition. And when the work was finished, when Ma Rainey's Black Bottom was complete and there was nothing left to film, he died. 12 stories. 12 unfinished legacies. And now that the countdown has reached its conclusion, there is one final question this documentary has been building toward since the very first entry. Not what these 12 people left behind, but what their stories, taken together, are asking us to do with what remains. What they left behind. Every name on this countdown left the world before the world was ready to let them go. But here is what this documentary has attempted to show across 12 entries and thousands of miles of documented history. These were not simply lives cut short. They were lives fully committed to craft, to community, to the particular kind of excellence that does not wait for comfortable conditions before it begins. Lopes was still writing. Phyllis Hyman was still singing. Len Bias had not yet played a single professional game. Bernie Mac was still making Chicago laugh through lungs that were slowly failing him. Clarke Duncan had only just proven what he was capable of. Eazy-E was preparing to start over. Whitney Houston had just demonstrated one final time that the voice was still present underneath everything that had tried to silence it. Nipsey Hussle had a meeting scheduled for the morning after he died, a meeting about peace, about intervention, about making the community safer for the generation coming up behind him. Jackie Wilson spent 8 years in a care facility that bore no resemblance to the stages he had commanded. Aaliyah had film roles waiting. Tupac had a label to build and music that the world will never hear. Chadwick Boseman had children to visit, kings to play, and stories to tell that August Wilson and Ryan Coogler and a generation of black filmmakers were ready to help him bring to life. What remains is not simply memory. What remains is active, still streaming, still screening, still cited, still studied, still felt in the bodies of performers who learned from watching them, and in the hearts of audiences who never stopped listening. The work outlives the worker. That is not consolation, that is documentation, and it carries its own form of accountability, a reminder that the culture which celebrates black excellence has a responsibility to protect it while it is still present, still breathing, and still becoming. 12 names. 12 legacies still in motion. One conclusion that is not really a conclusion at all, because none of these stories are finished. They are simply continuing without the people who started them. And that, more than any ranking or any revelation this documentary has offered, is why we keep coming back to these names, not to grieve, not to sensationalize, but to remember completely, which means remembering the whole person, the full career, the private struggle alongside the public triumph, the exploitation alongside the excellence, and the human being underneath every icon the culture decided to celebrate. That is what they deserved while they were here. It is the least we can offer now that they are gone. If you stayed until the end of this documentary, thank you, genuinely, for spending this time with these 12 remarkable stories. Every entry on this countdown represented hours of careful research, verified sourcing, and a deep commitment to telling these lives with the completeness and respect they deserve. If this documentary moved you, educated you, or reminded you of someone whose story matters to you, subscribe now. Every week, this channel releases carefully researched black celebrity documentaries that preserve important legacies, celebrate remarkable lives, and uncover the stories that history should never be allowed to forget. Drop a comment below and tell us which entry on this countdown affected you most deeply. Was there a name you were surprised to see? A story you had never heard told this completely? A celebrity whose legacy you feel deserves its own full documentary? Your comments shape what we research next. Your subscriptions make it possible for us to keep doing this work, and your decision to share this documentary means that 12 more people, 12 more names, 12 more legacies reach an audience that might be hearing their complete story for the very first time. The next documentary is already in production, and if this countdown gave you any sense of what we are committed to building here, you will not want to miss it. Subscribe, comment, share, and thank you for honoring these lives by learning them completely.